The latest data on the US economy shows the inflation rate at 3.36%, a decrease from last year, and prices at the grocery store for such essentials as eggs, milk, and bread declining. Even the cost of gas has been on a downward trend. Democratic President Joe Biden, who is seeking re-election this year, says the data is proof his economic policies are working. But Donald Trump, the presumptive Republican nominee for president, and leaders of his Republican Party contend Biden's economic policies are built on quicksand, and the gains he talks about are just an illusion. So who's right? I'm Bertram de Souza, veteran Mahoning Valley journalist and host of the Scribbler podcast, streamed on YouTube and posted on the Scribbler Facebook page.
And I'm Dr. Taci Turel, a professor at Youngstown State University and the co-host and producer of this podcast. To answer the question as to who is right about the economy, Biden or Trump, we have invited two experts in the field. Dr. Joseph Palardy, professor of economics at the Lariccia School of Accounting and Finance at YSU, and Dr. Albert Summell, professor of economics, also at the Lariccia School. Well, thank you, Joe and AJ, for joining us to talk about the nation's economy in general and inflation in particular. And you know that there are a lot of fakers out there who present themselves as experts in the field. So I'd like to start by asking each of you to talk about your expertise as economists. AJ, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. So yeah, I'm a professor of economics at Youngstown State. I've been there since 2005. I can't say I have particular expertise in the area of inflation in terms of my research. I know Joe has done a good amount of research in that area, but my expertise, I guess, it relates to housing, and housing, of course, relates to inflation.
Joe?
Yeah, I'm Joe Palardy. I've been at YSU since 2003. Just a couple years before AJ. I do more macro economics. So kind of in particular, I've had papers published on inflation, especially kind of inflation expectations and looking at survey-based measures and some other measures of inflation expectations. So, I mean, I regularly kind of attend seminars on inflation. The Cleveland Fed puts out a good seminar series and usually an annual meeting on that. So I'm pretty up to date on kind of current inflation research,
Right.
and I keep tabs on inflation reports.
Oh, great, because this is exactly why Taji and I invited you to join us, because we really do need, and in fact, the working headline for this podcast is Inflation for Dummies, or we can change it to Economics for Dummies, whichever, because there's so much out there, especially on cable, that says. So let me start with this. With the release of April's Consumer Price Index, Democratic President Biden said this, quote, inflation has fallen more than 60% from its peak, and core inflation fell to its lowest level in 3 years. Prices are still too high, so my agenda will give families breathing room by building 2 million new homes to lower housing costs, taking on big pharma to lower prescription drug prices, and calling on grocery chains making record profits to lower grocery prices for consumers. But Donald Trump, the Republican who will be challenging Biden in November for the presidency, has a different viewpoint. Here's what he said. Bidenomics is an unmitigated disaster. Workers and families are literally paying the price for Joe Biden's failed economic policies, with prices on household essentials like gas, food, rent, and diapers skyrocketing. Baby food and formula alone are up 30%. Overall prices are up 20%, while real average weekly earnings are down 4.4% since Biden took office. The American people cannot afford 4 more years of Bidenomics. So give us your objective analysis of the economy today. And also, let's, please, if you would, talk about the prices at the grocery store and the gas pump, and whether the fact that the Republicans are, wrapping those around Joe Biden's neck is fair play. And Joe, let me start with you.
I think the headlines today that Target and a few others are going to be cutting prices. Economists tend to like to avoid looking at food and energy, right? Because food and energy is very volatile, right? If we're kind of the macro big picture view is looking at kind of long-term trends, what's happening in inflation and food and energy. I mean, I think you've seen like something happens maybe in the Middle East and gas prices can fluctuate 10%, right, overnight. So because they're so volatile, we'll sometimes remove them from the measures, right? And we'll call that kind of core measure of inflation, core CPI, if we're looking at consumer price index. So one other thing you also have to be careful about is oftentimes when you hear about these numbers and well things fell so much or have gained so much, you always have to be careful of the cherry picking of start years, right? So okay, if I want to show an economy growing really fast, my base year, the first part I'll start is when we're in like a bad recession. And then if I want things to look badly, what I'll do is I'll pick dates when we were at kind of a peak overall period. So when you're looking at the numbers, economists will tend to look at, okay, what's the long-term trend in inflation? Let's kind of remove some of the stuff that goes up and down really quite quickly, like food and energy. And if you look at those numbers, you see kind of a couple things especially with inflation. The pandemic was a big hit to supply chains, right? And we saw a lot of the big increase, 2022, 2021, right? You saw those, a lot of it was driven probably by supply chain crunches. Today, a lot of that's gone. But AJ probably can speak more to this than I can. The stubborn, persistent part has been housing. And for something like the consumer price index, which is what gets the headlines every month, it's already 1/3 based on housing. And if you say, well, let's remove food and energy, right, from that calculation, well, food and energy are about 20% of overall the weights on that CPI. So you're talking housing is almost 50% of the core measure of inflation. So when we're talking about current inflation, right, especially core, we're really alluding to, okay, what's happening with housing? And I think when I've looked at housing, I think some of the housing issues are supply issues that stem back from 2007, right? You saw dramatic declines in new housing construction, right? Starting in like 2000, I mean, it just kind of fell off a cliff, right? In 2007, 2008, and has never recovered. So there's probably some supply issues as well, and maybe AJ can talk a little bit more about some of those.
Sure. So, I mean, I'll just add a little bit to what Joe said. I mean, back to what both Trump and Biden were pointing to. I mean, technically, they're both actually accurate, right? Because it's just a matter of what they're comparing it to. Right. I mean, Biden saying that inflation has gone down 60% from its peak. I mean, that's correct, but it's still not where we want it to be, not where the Fed shoots for it to be, which is 2%, right? So just a couple of years ago was, I think, at its peak above 9%. And now in the most recent report, it's at 3.4%, right? So we've made a huge amount of progress, and it's come down faster than many expected it to come down, in large part because, as Joe pointed out, those supply chain issues have largely been resolved, but it's still not at the target rate of 2%. And so, when Trump points to the fact that inflation is still higher than, well, we'd like it to be, and in particular sectors, it's still high. That is also accurate. And so I do think, politically, it is a very weak point for Biden, because inflation has been a problem since Biden has been in office. In large part, you can argue not due to him or his policies, and any policies that can be implemented to try to address inflation, they take time, right? And so, you know, and in large part, it's a monetary policy that determines it. And the Fed has made a good amount of progress, as I've said. But anything like, for example, just building new housing, before you see that increase in supply take effect and impact actually, you know, market prices for housing, it takes years for that to happen. And so housing has been the most persistent issue in terms of why inflation remains stubborn above what the Fed targets as far as its rate of 2%.
What are the factors that have contributed to this housing crisis? What's going on in housing, and you know, what can in fact the administration do when Biden talks about building 2 million new homes?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a legitimate response to the problem, or is it a political response to the problem?
I mean, I'd say it is both legitimate and political, right? Because the fact is, increasing the supply of honestly anything will create downward pressure in the market, right? And so in terms of prices, and so increasing the supply would result in a decrease in prices, other factors constant. But it's just with housing in particular, that takes years before, one, the housing is built, and two, before the effect is seen in terms of prices. And so in terms of what's created these high housing prices and why it's been so stubborn in terms of not decreasing certainly as rapidly as the Federal Reserve wants it to, or Biden wants it to, is largely driven by, I mean, there's a number of factors you can point to. I'd say a really significant one, though, is the fact that interest rates increased dramatically, right? And that's the Fed's response to high inflation. That's the main lever that they have, is increase interest rates, which increase borrowing costs, which decrease demand for generally larger products, durable products. And that has had the desired effect. But an unintended or undesirable outcome of that is now people who are locked in their 30-year mortgages, or even 15-year mortgages at 3% or 2% interest rates, are much more reluctant to sell their homes because they would have to refinance at a much higher mortgage rate, right? And so that's going to create a lower supply of new housing in the market because people don't want to sell their homes.
Right.
Yeah, and the higher interest rates also affect the ability of certain businesses to borrow to build new homes. So it also probably is affecting things within the pipeline. I mean, you look at new housing starts in Ohio, they've never recovered since 2007. They're up a little bit, right? But they're not there. So housing is going to take a while, right? And I don't think there's any kind of magic bullet that you're going to be able to use to get them to come down rapidly.
When did the housing crisis begin? Because as you were talking, I'm reminded about, okay, so the American dream is home ownership. It has always been that, you know, you go ahead, you get married, you have children, you can buy a home. But isn't that attitude also changing, where a lot of young professionals are not interested in home ownership, right? They're not their grandparents, you know, sort of ties. So let's talk about housing and how this crisis occurred, when it went back, and of changing attitudes towards housing ownership, home ownership.
Yeah, I mean, and I just point out that it's not just housing prices that are an issue. It's also rental markets. Price of rents has not been decreasing, and that's been a big part of inflation, or keeping the CPI above that 2% rate. And so Yeah, it's not just a matter of, say, home ownership that is driving the issue and the increase in the value of homes. It's also been the increase in rental markets, and in particular, in, I'd say, out west, the Sun Belt, and South in general have seen large increases in rents in the past few years.
I wanted to ask you, since housing prices usually lag about a year or so, or anything you do about housing, you will not see the impact of that very quickly. So can you explain how the economic policies of the Biden administration have impacted inflation and overall economic growth? And if you compare it to Trump's proposed economic policies, how do you compare those?
So the main driver of policy, at least we believe in terms of inflation, is usually monetary policy and what happens at the Fed. We do have a fairly independent Fed right now. They've been fairly aggressive raising interest rates to try to bring and basically kind of slow the economy down and bring inflation back under the control. And they've been largely successful. They haven't been as successful as they had wanted to. Still, we're not at 6%. We're at what? Realistically, if you look at the Fed's preferred inflation measure, which is a little bit different than the headlines with CPI, it's called the PCE, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, and it treats the difference between that and the CPI is how they treat medical care and housing. A lot of medical care is paid not directly by the consumer, right? It's paid for by things like Medicare or some other things. So that's going to be a bit different. And housing in the CPI, they use something called owner's equivalent rent, right? Where they try to come up with an idea of how much rent would you pay for a house that you would own, right? So in the PCE, it just is like housing expenditure. But anyway, that's about 2.7% last I checked. I think it comes out, next one comes next week, end of next week. Kind of going back, right? It's monetary policy, I believe, is kind of the most effective and quickest acting in terms of bringing inflation under control. Fiscal policy, you could say that some of the expansionary fiscal policy coming from COVID and the COVID payments that we saw both in the Trump administration and the Biden administration, right, would be somewhat inflationary, right? If we give people money, people spend that money, and part of that goes to, right, will go to price increases as well. In terms of other things, like what has the administration or current administrative done, probably some of that's hidden through what they've done in terms of ports and supply chains, trying to deal with that don't get a lot of headlines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what Joe said. The ability of any, particularly president, to directly impact inflation is very, very limited. Because any mechanism or any policies that they implement, they're either, by necessity, long-term policies. So even things like, like we said, building 2 million new housing units, we're not going to see the impact of that until, at least 2 years, I'd say, before that would register in terms of the market. Or another policy that the Biden administration passed is the CHIPS Act, to try to increase the capacity of, in particular, the U.S. to produce its own semiconductors and to prevent another where there was a big shortage, and that was driving an increase in new car prices. But that's largely been resolved in terms of there's no major shortage anymore, but this would at least potentially increase the availability of those US built semiconductors in the future and prevent potential future inflation as a result of that type of shortage. But that also, takes several years before we'd see any impact. I mean, so most of the policies that any president puts forward or passes it would take years before it has an impact in terms of markets and inflationary pressure. But as Joe said, the main things would be anything that affects demand, the demand side of it, and potential to create demand pull inflation. Or, I think you could have minor impacts here and there in terms of like something that decreases prescription prices, which Biden has done and wants to do more of. Potentially tariffs could have an impact. I think, relatively minor, but still, if we're, and Biden, it's like the only thing that Biden and Trump agree on is that we should increase the amount of tariffs on, in particular, Chinese imports. But that obviously does not help in terms of inflation. You're directly increasing the prices of those imports, which is passed along to U.S. consumers.
So Joe had said that economists, when analyzing the economy, don't necessarily look at food and energy costs. But you'll both recall that when Bill Clinton was running, his main, advisor, Jim Carville, came up with that it's the economy, stupid, regarding the election. And it was reflecting what he believed the American voters consider when they go to the polls is what it costs to live their daily lives. And NPR did a piece, and when it says that Target says it is dropping the prices of 5,000 common items, joining a growing list of stores trying to draw inflation-weary shoppers. The list of price cuts include milk, bread, soda, meat, fresh fruit, vegetables, etc. If indeed food and energy prices aren't a realistic sort of indicator of the health of the economy, how do we sort of persuade the American public, especially the American voter, not to judge on those bases? Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I did some research with one of our colleagues, Tomio Vasca, looking at just inflation expectations and what drives inflation expectations for things like household. And well, it's food and energy prices, especially energy prices, that they have kind of an outsized effect on what people believe inflation is going to be. So whereas I say, well, economists tend to dismiss it a little bit because we're interested in kind of what's happening in terms of the trend of inflation, right? Is inflation accelerating or is it declining? And we can't make heads or tails if it's up and down, right? If you just look at a picture of like energy price inflation, I mean, it's just all over the place, right? And sometimes you could be up as much as 20-30% in terms of gasoline prices in a month. And that's really hard for us to deal with, right? With that level of noise and that level of volatility. I wouldn't call it noise, right? But we'll just say volatility.
Right.
But households, I think you are right? Households do look at food and energy. They consider that more than most everything else. Whereas if I'm the economist and looking at, right, I'm saying, well, yeah, that's only 20% of the overall CPI numbers, right? Is food and energy.
I would say there's always the economic reality and there's the political reality, and those are rarely the same, right? And so the political reality is energy and food are probably the most important part of the CPI, and most important, what happens to them determines the ability for any politician, in particular president, to say that their policies are successful or not is based on what's happening in particular to food and energy. Whereas with what Joe said, what economists look at is what's happening overall and what the trend is. So you can actually see situations where food and energy prices are up, which politically is a disaster for Biden, but overall inflation is down, right? And so the way that's perceived by voters or in general the American public consumers is that inflation, I don't care what you tell me inflation is. I see that, the price of eggs has gone up 50%, which it did last year, right? And so that's what they see and that's what they feel. And you can't, and I'd say in those cases, it's like the reality doesn't matter. The perception is what matters when it comes to politics, right?
Also going to add that um, if we're talking about inflation, right, we're talking about the rate of change of prices, right? Um, when people when you ask people questions about inflation, you realize that they're really more looking at the level of prices, right? In comparison to sometimes what they have kind of anchored in the past, right? So what do you like? Okay, you went to the grocery store a few years ago, right? You remember eggs being $1, right? And maybe that's when you were shopping quite a bit, and now they're $3, right, for a dozen, right? So you see that as that big increase, whereas yeah, the rate of change over the last month in egg prices might be actually down, right? Actually, I think it was up because of bird flu again. People's perceptions, right, are based on their reality, right? And not necessarily looking at, I shouldn't say their reality, maybe not necessarily looking at a rate of change, right? But on a level compared to some level that they're used to in the past.
Right.
I saw this posted on online, and I thought about it, and perhaps you two can respond to it. It says, anytime you see the word inflation in the news, replace it with, quote, record-breaking corporate profits, and you'll be a lot closer to the truth.
Oh,
Yes.
I mean, I'll say a little bit about that. I mean, it's if you look at the role of corporations in contributing to inflation, that it's like you could ask, why do corporations increase prices? The answer is because they can, right? And because it's profitable to do so. So you do see like we talked about Target. They announced they're decreasing the prices of more than 5,000 goods, and that's in response to the fact that there's been a decrease in sales. But just last quarter, I believe they had record-breaking profits, higher profit level than they'd ever had before. And so the only way you can see those two statistics be accurate, where you have a decrease in sales but record-breaking profits, is through an increase in prices, right? So they have, a lot of these large corporations have been increasing prices, and it's had the desired impact in terms of, well, increasing their profit levels, right? And so, to say it's all just about corporate greed, I think is little too like a bumper sticker type of thing. But there's no doubt that firms' ability to increase prices has contributed to inflation. It's just not the only reason that inflation has been increasing, or has been persistently high, I should say.
I'll give maybe the typical economist answer, and it depends, right? It depends on what industry and sector you're really looking at, and the levels of competition, right? So, in certainly certain highly competitive sectors, right? I doubt there's not as much of the ability for firms to raise their prices, like, but I mean, okay, in terms of food, right? There's been a lot of consolidation in the grocery store business, right? So is it that consolidation, right, that's leading to their ability to increase prices? We've seen consolidation in cell phones, right? We lost Sprint. We're down to three carriers. There's consolidation in other places as well. So I think that has to be part of the story as well, in terms of overall competition and the ability of firms. So, like I said, it depends on what sector we're looking at. And in some cases, it depends on whether or not there's been a lot of consolidation or there's monopolies in that particular area.
I mean, there are a lot of social media posts circulating about the economy. And one of the posts that I have seen, which has gotten a lot of views, says families need an extra $11,590 annually just to maintain the same standard of living they enjoyed 3 years ago. Do you agree with that And also, when you look at the labor market, I mean, this corporate profits are going up, but how do you see the wage growth versus inflation?
I mean, so I can't speak specifically to the accuracy of that figure or that post. I tend to view a lot of what's posted on social media cynically, or just, unless it's from a verifiable source. And I'm not saying that it's inaccurate. I just don't know specifically if that value of 11,590 is correct. But there is no doubt, like if you look at how price levels have changed since Biden has been in office, and it was close to 20%. I believe it was between 18 and 19% in total, right? Which is, so if you just look at that over the, say, past 3.5 years, that's a pretty significant increase in terms of average price level. So it means $1 today is worth approximately 20% less than $1 was worth 3.5 years ago, right? But that does not account for, well, how income has changed in those 3.5 years, right? And so that's what matters, right? It's not just how prices change, it's not just how wages change, it's how or income changes, I should say, because it's not just wages. It's whether one is changing faster than the other, right? And so if prices are increasing more rapidly than income is increasing, then there's a decrease in standard of living. If the opposite is true, then there's an improvement in standard of living. The thing is, I mean, it also ties to just the political reality of, you can point to the fact that prices have increased almost 20% and ignore the fact that income has also increased by almost that same amount over time in terms of median income levels, right? It's kind of skewed towards higher income, but you might see a difference in terms of the change of standard of living based on your income stratification. But nonetheless, the labor market has been incredibly strong throughout Biden's term over the past 3.5 years, incredibly resilient. We still have unemployment below 4%.
Right.
I think the thing is, politically, inflation is more damaging than unemployment is. That if the president had to choose, I mean, they both matter. They're both really important. The thing with inflation is it affects everybody, right? That literally everybody is affected by high inflation, whether you're high income, low income, no matter where you live or any other socioeconomic demographic characteristics, you're impacted by inflation. Whereas unemployment, let's say unemployment were to go up to 10%, which is incredibly large, that only affects 10% of the workforce, right? And so not everybody's going to be impacted by unemployment in the same way that everybody is impacted by inflation. And that's why I think inflation has a greater impact in terms of politically than unemployment would.
And yet the Republicans are successfully making the case that it's Biden's economic policies that are driving the inflation rate, and therefore he should be blamed for it. We cannot depend on the talking heads, especially on cable, to give us a apolitical, objective view as to this issue. So as economists, when you watch television and you listen to these so-called experts spouting off, is that cringeworthy for both of you? Do you sort of want to start screaming at the screen as to what's going on? Joe, go first, because I'm trying to get a perspective here as to how to change the economic intellect of the American public.
I try not to watch cable news that much. So, I mean, where do I get my information, right? I'll sometimes read some different newspapers, or I'll look at the actual report. So like it comes, right, the next unemployment report, first Friday of every month, right? I will look at the actual unemployment report rather than, and sometimes I'll listen to how it's spun. I think sometimes you get into situations where, right, and maybe I'm kind of a little bit referring to some of the recent surveys showing just how badly people view, right, the economy, right? So was it like half of people thought we were in a recession? I don't know the exact numbers from that particular survey. I think it's a New York Times survey, I think. But no, I think almost any president in the last like 20, 30 years would probably trade economic numbers, right, with Joe Biden right now, right? I mean, 3 point something unemployment rate. Inflation is a little bit high, but it's not crazy high, right? I mean, we're talking 3%, 4%, right?
Right.
It's nothing like Argentina or Venezuela or right Turkey or other places where right where they've had considerable levels of inflation that they make our 3% like yeah come on it's 3%, maybe 4%, right? But they're still in this kind of overall doom and gloom view of the economy, and some of it probably is that the narratives that are kind of spun around it, right? You have politicalization of economic reporting, right? Where and I can always do it, right? I know if you tell me to make things look bad, right? How am I going to do it, right? I know how I'm going to do it. I'm going to cherry pick my base years, right? I will, if I'm looking at my inflation numbers, guess what? I'm going through the detailed list and seeing what increased the most, right? And maybe it was eggs, right? Eggs, flour, butter, or something like that, right?
Diapers, yeah.
Yeah, diapers, right? I can run through that entire list and give you one or two examples of things that increase crazily, right? I'm not giving you the stuff that went way down, right? I'm only giving you the stuff that went way up, right? So it in some cases, and maybe that's why I try to avoid it sometimes. There is, I think some of the issue is engagement, right? Um, what engages people, and what engages people is scare tactics in some ways, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if I want to get clicks, right, I'm going to tell you that things are worse than they actually are, right? Overall. So yeah, maybe that's why I try to avoid those types of things and just look at um the fundamental numbers that are coming out, make my kind of decisions based on that.
Yeah, like with Joe, I mean, I also avoid actively cable news. I don't even subscribe to cable. And so I guess you could say it is cringeworthy that when I do see it, which occasionally like on just someone else's TV or something. But I think it's just based on, you could cherry pick anything and make it seem either better or worse than the actual general picture. And so often what's spouted there is just not a fair representation of reality.
One thing I have noticed is every time there's an election and somebody's elected president, and then that first year, the stock market goes up and economy is great. And then everybody goes, oh, the president is doing a great job. The economy is great. But based on what you're telling us, any policies, we won't see the impacts of that over, 2, 3, sometimes 4 years. So when we have a president and in their first year, the economy is great, should we say that this is the impact of the previous president's policies?
I mean, I think that likely is the case that you would see. So I think it's fair to say that what happens in the first year of any presidency is not because of the policies that were implemented by that president, right? So I think you saw the opposite with Biden, right? Where the economy was a disaster. Well, a disaster, right, in his first year. But it had nothing to do with anything that he did, and he should not take the blame for that. But he had the worst. So he had high unemployment initially and subsequently high inflation, right? And in large part, there was no ability for him. That would have been the case regardless of who was president at the time.
And with Trump presidency, the first year, everybody talked about how Trump was great because the economy was going so well that first year, if you remember. So I feel like there's that perception that, when somebody's president, everything that happens is based on, as soon as he took over.
Right. What the conditions were when he took office.
Right.
But there are some positive signs, as you've said, and both of you have said. For example, the stock market, went over what, 40,000?
Mhm.
A lot of workers are in the stock market through, their 401ks or their union, investments or whatever. So is that benefit not being derived to the extent that people will then say, okay, yeah, inflation is, not that 2% that the Fed wants it to be, but yet, look at my 401k, and I'm doing very well because of the stock market. Is that a realistic way to look at things? Joe?
Once again, it depends, right? I mean, still a large portion of the public doesn't have any stocks, or I mean, they will through sometimes deferred compensation plans. But if you look at the distribution, right, of people that own stocks, right, as the market goes up, it disproportionately helps those at the really typically the top of also the income and wealth distribution. In some ways, when we see the stock market doing really well, right, we're seeing it disproportionately affect, right, those in those higher income and wealth stratifications, even though it might have a positive effect on everybody kind of within the economy. The stock market it's not the best maybe overall measure of the economy as itself, right? It moves for various reasons. Sometimes it's not what happening today, but what people believe is going to be happening in
Right.
the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years, right? They believe interest rates are going to have to come back down eventually. They're predicting increases in profits, stability, right? Sometimes, like at least with like the S&P, it's really becoming disproportionate in terms of some of the bigger tech companies, right? And things like Facebook and Google and Microsoft, and some of it's rising that the AI optimism wave as well with some of those big tech companies. And the stock market, I mean, it's great for a lot of people that is up, but I wouldn't use it as a really great measure or barometer of the economy as a whole.
Yeah, I
Go
think
ahead.
that's a fair assessment. And it's like if you try to tie the relationship between what's been happening with stocks and inflation, it's not a surprise that when inflation rises, stock prices also generally tend to rise, right? Because a lot of that is going in the form of higher prices, which is sold by firms, which are therefore also generating higher profits, right? And so, yeah, it's not really surprising that if inflation is higher, stock prices will also be higher. And I think the benefits of those stocks, as Joe said, tend to go towards those who have higher income and higher wealth already. And so what you're seeing is generally just a further transfer away from lower income to higher income as inflation increases for two reasons. One, because the assets, which will also increase when inflation increases, are largely owned by the higher income. But two, because inflation affects lower income more than it affects higher income people, right? Because lower income people spend a much higher proportion of their income because if you have an income of say 20,000, you're going to be spending 100% of your income, right? If you have an income of 200,000, you could be okay spending 50% of your income, right? And so the effect of that inflation will have a much greater impact on the individuals who have an income of 20,000 than of 200,000. And so I think that's part of also why you've seen, a lot of the sentiment of the anger about inflation comes in large part from lower income individuals because they're the ones that have felt the greatest impact as a result of it.
Right. And in some cases, their wages have not kept up, right?
Right.
Especially if you're making something around the minimum wage, right? Minimum wage is really, I think, some of the lowest it's been since it was established. Yeah, I mean, even like $15 an hour. I think the numbers that I remember was $15 an hour is what the minimum wage was in 1968 in real, right, in real terms, once you adjust for inflation. So, right? The lower income have not done well. And especially with the most recent one, because we haven't been raising the minimum wage. There's no way you could get that minimum wage increase in the federal minimum wage passed through this Congress, right? It's never going to happen.
We hear a lot about recession or a potential recession, and I believe Warren Buffett recently talked about a potential recession and that he was staying in cash mostly. Are we going to have a recession? And what's your outlook for the US economy over the next 2 to 5 years? What are some of the potential risks and opportunities?
So will we have a recession? Yes, absolutely, 100%. Just as a matter of when.
Yeah.
And that's the tough thing to predict, right? When are we going to have a recession, not if we're going to have a recession? That's tough, right? I mean, we had very few recessions since 2001, right? We've had like one big one minor one. Yeah, that's it, right?
Mhm.
So right now we're on a pace for one every 10 years. The numbers right now look pretty good, right? I haven't seen a lot of the warning signs too much. Do we see a big drop in some of our leading predictors, right? We'd see big drops in new home construction. We'd see drops in those when people are making decisions based upon the future, right? Sometimes they would act today, right? So we're not seeing those right now. But okay, at least with COVID, that was an unpredictable shock that kind of led to a recession, right? The 2007, 2008, right? You're talking housing price crashes, right? And in a bubble in the housing market. Do we see that again? I'm not sure. Some of the things in terms of, I know there's some issues with regional banks and especially corporate real estate, especially in cities. That could be an issue.
So we usually have a recession every 10 years, you said?
Recently. So our last recessions, we had one with COVID. The one
Mhm.
before that was the housing price crash, right?
Yeah, the Great
2007,
Recession.
2008. One before that was 2001, 2001.
Tech bubble. Yeah.
Yeah, the tech bubble crash.
I could guarantee you that we will have a recession. It like sometime in the next century, right? There's 100% chance that we will have a recession again. But it doesn't appear to be imminent. That all economic indicators suggest that we are not in danger of falling into a recession, like in the next year, right, or before the end of the year. But then it's also, there could be something completely unforeseen
Right.
that happens that changes that scenario. And so, yeah, Warren Buffett, I mean, moving his a lot of his portfolios or assets into cash, I don't think was based on a concern over a recession. It was just you can get still high interest rates on cash, and he just thought it was the best thing to maximize the value of Berkshire Hathaway's portfolio, right? So, yeah, most economists, most investors are not predicting a recession in the immediate future, but we know that it will happen again at some point.
And finally, before we leave, if there are people out there who want to sort of are genuinely interested in learning about the economy and in talking about inflation, beyond watching this podcast and the two of you, are there any other sources, legitimate sources, that they can go to, that you can point to, that would say, okay, if you want to understand America's economy, inflation, the price gouging, everything else involved, here's a good source to go to? Can you think of something that our viewers might be sort of interested in?
You could enroll in YSU economics courses. Right?
And they really do. And the new
Econ program.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, so I think there definitely are a lot of good, legitimate sources that that discuss the economy, economic conditions, how they're changing, that can be trusted in terms of the analyses that they put forward. I wouldn't expect anybody without an economics background to look for academic journals, let's say, or what the Bureau of Labor Statistics is publishing. But I mean, I think just general popular. I do subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. They have good, reliable analyses of economic conditions. I do look at a lot of other popular media sources, the New York Times being one of them.
We do have a few people a few economists who do write for a general audience,
Sure.
but the technical papers on inflation get very difficult very fast. You're talking some fairly sophisticated mathematical models, some really in-depth calculations. The one I was looking at today, so they were trying to come up with a supply index, right? Supply chain index. So they were using maps. We were actually using satellite photos of ports, right? So they picked 50 ports and then had some really in-depth machine learning algorithms trying to extract density of ships and stuff like that so it got crazy complicated really fast, right? In terms of the level of analysis that they were trying to do. So I mean, if you want, there's some economists, you'll occasionally see him on the news, people like Justin Wolfers. I think he might be as like a CNN contributor. You'll see some other ones that generally contribute to things like that, or you'll see some op-eds. They can get you kind of some of the way there.
As a source for judging how well the economy is doing or what is happening with inflation, I think any reputable media source that it means I'm just saying don't trust what you see just on social media, don't trust what you hear about on cable news. Not to say it's inaccurate, it's just as we spoke about, largely cherry-picked information. But I do think articles that you read in newspapers or magazines, they're going to report accurate information, and it has to be based on actual facts. And so I do trust a lot more anything I read in, say, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times about the economy than anything I would see online, on social media, or on cable news.
I have one last question. We talked about the supply chain issues, and I just wanted to know, to what extent are global economic conditions, such as the war in Ukraine or the conflict in Gaza or the economic policies in China, how much do they affect inflation in the US?
That's a tough last question.
Yeah. That's a research paper for a PhD candidate. They obviously affect to some extent, right? Especially things that are very much global and shipped around the world, right? So you're talking, did the war in Ukraine have influence on energy prices? Yes, it did. And we saw that, right? Did it also have some influence on food prices? Yes, depending upon where you were in the world. So the story was from the 90s, 2000s, 2010s was increase of globalization and increase interconnectedness, right? So we saw, policy in China could have some effects on what happens in the US, since we're a large importer of Chinese goods. Wars could have impact, right? Especially around oil, right? And oil prices. I think things are probably becoming a little more disconnected now, right? Relatively speaking, you see more, right? People kind of forming blocks. What happens in China, right, might have less, right? And we're actively trying to do those types of things, right? We're building chip factories here, right? To try to prevent, okay, if something happened in Taiwan, to prevent that from having global consequences,
Yeah, I mean, so it definitely has an effect, whatever happens internationally. But I do think, yeah, the general effect of international events has been declining, and there's been a desire to be less, I'd say, susceptible to international events in the U.S.
So it's
And
like a
so,
reverse globalization type thing going on, you think?
yeah, I mean, I think if you're just looking at, say, the total value of all imports and exports, there has not been a decline officially, and that imports and exports have continued to increase, at least from the U.S. But I think it's tied to just I guess a general sense of maybe populism that you call it around the world that's been increasing, and a desire to be more isolationist in terms of the economy.
Yeah, and there's trade-offs, right? We can become more self-sufficient, right? But that's going to have a negative impact on the consumer, right? We aren't going to get as much cheap stuff as we have, right? So it'll come with increased costs. So there's no free lunch.
Well, thank you both very much for giving us your time and sharing with us your expertise and your insights. Obviously, this is going to be a major issue. The economy will, inflation will in the November election. And thus far, I think Donald Trump and the Republicans have done a pretty good job of pounding Biden over the head with what's going on. And I don't know, how many voters are willing to actually look at things objectively anymore, not only on the economy but every other issue. So we can
Right.
always be hopeful.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.